In Buchenwald, thousands of prisoners died under a regime of torture and systematic abuse. Among the responsible was a woman whose name became synonymous with sadism, Ilse Koch. Her power within the camp was absolute, and her cruelty was recorded in every testimony. The prisoners were beaten, branded, and selected for punishments that defied all limits. Under his command, suffering was transformed into spectacle and humiliation into daily routine. His figure became an emblem of Nazi brutality, remembered even by the guards themselves. How did she come to wield such extreme power within a concentration camp? What evidence was enough to put her in the dock? What was the end of the woman known as the Sadistic Queen of the Third Reich? The Dark Seed, a youth shaped by the German defeat. Ilse Koch was born in September of 1906 in the city of Dresden within the German Empire. Her family belonged to the urban working sector. Her father was a foreman in the local industry, and the household had regular income, albeit without prospects of significant social advancement. The available records about her childhood indicate that she grew up in an everyday environment, marked by the routine of a working-class family, without extraordinary episodes that drew attention in her early years. When she was still a girl, Germany became embroiled in the First World War. Dresden, as an industrial center, quickly transformed. Workshops and factories were geared towards war production, while young men marched to the front. The shortage of food and basic products became visible in the daily life of the city. The streets showed long lines to get bread or coal, and the military uniform became part of the urban landscape. The defeat of 1918 not only meant the return of wounded and mutilated soldiers, but also a radical change in national life. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe limitations on the German army, the loss of strategic territories, and the commitment to pay reparations considered unaffordable. The entire society felt marked by a humiliation that was passed on to the younger generations, including Ilse's. The immediate subsequent period was defined by economic instability. Between 1921 and 1923, hyperinflation reduced the savings of millions of families to figures with no real value. Within hours, prices skyrocketed, and cash lost all purchasing power. Dresden was no exception. Ilse's family, like many others, experienced the frustration of seeing how a month's salary was not enough even for the minimum needs. This collective experience marked those who lived their youth in that stage and generated a widespread willingness to listen to speeches that promised stability and regained greatness. Upon completing basic education, Ilse decided to train in administrative skills. She studied accounting, shorthand, and typing, which allowed her to obtain employment as a secretary in local offices and work as an accounting assistant. For a working-class woman in the Weimar Republic, this path was not unusual, although it represented a moderate upward trajectory compared to those who remained in domestic work without access to technical education. During the 1920s, German women achieved greater presence in the workforce, although the majority remained concentrated in jobs considered appropriate for their gender. The political atmosphere of the time was dominated by polarization. In Dresden, as in other German cities, the streets were the scene of clashes between communists, social democrats, and nationalist groups. The press frequently repeated the themes of resentment over the defeat and the urgency of a national revival. In that context, the messages of the National Socialist Party, still a minority, found fertile ground. Their symbols of discipline, unity, and racial purity attracted young people in search of belonging. In 1932, Ilse decided to join the Nazi Party. She was 26 years old. Her membership coincided with the phase of rapid growth of the movement in the months prior to Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Joining at that early stage granted a special status within the party. The so-called old members were seen as loyal militants before the definitive victory, which translated into prestige and promotional opportunities within the regime. For a woman of modest origin like Ilse, it also meant a space to gain recognition and escape the traditional limits of her social class. National Socialism attributed to women a defined role within its ideological project. Hitler and other leaders presented the female mission as ensuring the reproduction of the Aryan population. The slogan summarizing this conception was "Children, Kitchen and Church." However, beyond this simplification, reality showed an active participation of millions of women in administrative, educational, propagandistic tasks, and, later on, within the concentration apparatus. Starting from 1933, the Nazi state promoted demographic policies designed to increase birth rates. Marriage loans were created that were partially or fully cancelled according to the number of children born. Special subsidies were granted to large families. And in 1938, the Cross of Honor of the German Mother was instituted as a public recognition to those who fulfilled the ideal of motherhood promoted by the regime. In parallel, coercive measures were developed against those who did not fit the racial model. Thousands of women classified as biologically inferior were subjected to forced sterilization. Prostitution was regulated to serve the soldiers, while relationships with foreign workers were severely punished. The control of the female body was absolute. Those who conformed to the Aryan ideal were rewarded, and those who deviated from it were publicly punished. Women accused of maintaining ties with prisoners of war were shaved and exposed to humiliation ceremonies. In 1936, Heinrich Himmler established the Lebensborn program. Its aim was to encourage the births of children considered racially pure. To achieve this, maternity homes were created and economic support was offered to women selected based on their genetic profile. Although the total number of births within this framework was limited, the symbolism of the program reflected the Nazi intention to intervene even in the most intimate aspects of private life. The participation of women in Nazism was not marginal. More than 10 million women joined organizations linked to the party. The League of German Girls trained young women in physical discipline and racial doctrine. The National Socialist Women's Association coordinated aid campaigns and propaganda activities. With the start of the war, many went on to serve as nurses, secretaries, police auxiliaries, collaborators in the Wehrmacht, and staff in concentration camps. Women's militancy combined ideological obedience and personal ambition. In a society that offered few alternatives for public participation for women, the party presented itself as a platform for action and recognition. Some devoted themselves to welfare tasks, but others rose to positions with real influence within the state and paramilitary structure. Wedding with the Executioner, the rise of the Kochs. By the mid-1930s, Ilse Koch met Karl Otto Koch within the circles of SS officials and officers. Her early affiliation with the Nazi Party had placed her in an environment where political and personal connections frequently intertwined. Koch, born in Darmstadt in 1897, represented a distinct generation, marked by the direct experience of the First World War. After serving as a soldier, he joined the Freikorps, paramilitary formations that proliferated in the turbulent German post-war period and served as a breeding ground for future cadres of National Socialism. Karl Otto's career within the SS had taken shape thanks to the expansion of the concentration camp system that Heinrich Himmler had been promoting since 1933. By 1934, Koch was already holding positions of responsibility in camps such as Esterwegen and Lichtenberg. His experience in managing political prisoners and his loyalty to the regime made him a reliable officer for the hierarchy. In that context, the bond with Ilse consolidated a union that would soon be formalized. In 1936, they married, after overcoming the mandatory procedure for all SS members. The institution required a rigorous genealogical control that had to prove the racial purity of the spouses going back several generations. The couple obtained approval without difficulty, which reinforced their position in the select environment of the organization. For Ilse, marriage meant not only social advancement but also full integration into the power structure of National Socialism. That same year, Karl Otto was appointed commander of the Sachsenhausen camp in Oranienburg, north of Berlin. Conceived as a model camp, Sachsenhausen functioned both as an internment center and as a training school for future SS officers. Its triangular layout, dominated by a central watchtower, allowed complete visual control over the space. This design would become an architectural reference for the camps created later. The facility was initially intended for political prisoners, common criminals, and individuals classified as asocial. Under Koch's regime, internal discipline was organized through graduated punishments, forced labor, and a system of daily appeals that reinforced submission. For the inmates, life was marked by constant deprivation. For the commanders, on the other hand, it meant the consolidation of a career within the Nazi hierarchy. The living conditions of the commanders and their families contrasted radically with those of the prisoners. Within the perimeter of the camp stood spacious and equipped homes, partly attended by internees selected as servants. Regular contacts with the ruling elite of the SS conferred social prestige, while the daily routine included comforts unknown to the majority of the German population of the time. In that context, Ilse began to perform as a secretary and administrative collaborator, in addition to gaining visibility in an environment where the wives of commanders were observed as representatives of the Nazi ideal. In Sachsenhausen, Karl Otto Koch demonstrated efficiency in the management of discipline and the organization of forced labor. The camp operated as a laboratory for control methods that would later be replicated elsewhere. The inmates built barracks, workshops, and offices, in addition to participating in external industrial projects. Koch's experience projected him as a candidate to assume greater responsibilities. In 1937, Himmler ordered the creation of a new camp near Weimar. The facility was to serve as a detention and labor exploitation center, as well as to relieve other already overcrowded camps. The chosen location was the forest of Ettersberg, and the appointed commander was Karl Otto Koch. The appointment represented a significant advancement in his career and placed the couple in a position of greater influence. The first prisoners arrived from Sachsenhausen in July of that year, with the task of constructing the facilities. They built barracks, electrified fences, watchtowers, workshops, and offices. The camp was named Buchenwald and was planned to accommodate several thousand inmates, although over time its capacity expanded to become one of the largest concentration camps in history, largest facilities in the German concentration camp system. The perimeter of Buchenwald included an electrified barbed wire fence and a double line of walls with guard posts. 23 watchtowers armed with machine guns ensured permanent control. The main entrance displayed the inscription "Jedem das Sein," translated as "to each his own," an expression that reflected the punitive and hierarchical logic of the regime. Inside was a large roll call square where daily counts were held, barracks aligned with geometric precision, forced labor workshops, kitchens, warehouses, and a punishment block known as the bunker, intended for torture and executions. Later, a crematorium, a recurring element in the network of Nazi camps, would also be built. In its initial phase, Buchenwald mainly received political prisoners, communist and social democrat opponents, as well as common criminals and people defined as asocial. Over time, the camp's population would diversify with Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and deportees from occupied territories. The management of Karl Otto Koch granted it a considerable margin of autonomy, with ample resources and direct support from the Central Inspectorate. While the inmates built the camp under extreme conditions, the Kochs' lives unfolded in a framework of privilege. A spacious villa was constructed for them with quality materials and luxurious furnishings, in whose construction prisoners also participated. The house had large rooms and carefully designed gardens. From there it was possible to see both the surrounding forest and parts of the inmates' facilities. The coexistence of these two worlds, barely separated by the barbed wire, characterized the daily life of the commanders and their families in the concentration camp system. The transfer to Buchenwald consolidated the Kochs' position within the elite of the SS. For Karl Otto, it meant the control of one of the Reich's most important facilities. For Ilse, it represented a new stage of integration in an environment where commanders' wives acquired visibility and informal power. in direct contact with the repressive structure that defined Nazism in its phase of expansion. The Witch of Buchenwald, limitless cruelty. In Buchenwald, the figure of Ilse Koch stood out from the rest of the concentration camp commanders' wives. While most maintained a discrete role limited to the domestic environment, she adopted an active presence in the camp's daily life. Survivor testimonies describe her roaming the facilities freely, exercising direct violence against the prisoners, and participating in the internal discipline in an unusual manner for a woman in her position. One of the most repeated aspects in the statements was her habit of riding a horse during forced labor days. With a whip in hand, she punished those she considered disobedient or distracted. The mere glance of an inmate was enough for her to order their punishment. The image of Ilsa on a horse, escorted by armed guards, became a symbol of the daily regime of Buchenwald and marked a clear difference from the role usually reserved for the wives of SS officers. In the post-war accounts, her inclination to deliberately humiliate prisoners was also noted. Various witnesses agreed in describing how she appeared in visible areas of the camp in provocative clothing or without clothes, waiting for reactions from the inmates. Anyone who dared to look was severely punished and even executed soon after. These practices, documented in judicial statements, showed a pattern of using the body as a tool of provocation to generate exemplary repression situations. The prisoners assigned as domestic servants in the Koch's villa reported similar experiences. According to these statements, Ilse forced the inmates to attend to her while she was naked, in a context that combined humiliation and absolute power. Most of those who were forced to participate in those situations disappeared shortly after, which fueled the perception that intimacy with the Kochs amounted to a death sentence. Another element that appears in numerous testimonies was her involvement in the selection and application of punishments. Among the most remembered are those directed at pregnant women, against whom she used whips reinforced with metal fragments. The result was deep wounds, mutilations, and in many cases forced abortions. Witnesses highlighted the violence of these episodes and the personal hostility that Ilse showed towards the inmates in a state of pregnancy, considered unproductive for the forced labor system. The children were also subjected to her violence. Survivors recounted scenes in which Ilse witnessed punishments against minors and reacted with visible satisfaction. During the Dachau trial, several witnesses stated that she laughed when the children were led to executions or medical experiments. These episodes cemented her reputation as a feared figure, even among particularly vulnerable populations within the camp. The sexual dimension of her behavior was another aspect documented in the trials. Some prisoners claimed that Ilse organized encounters where she forced inmates to engage in relations in the presence of SS officers and the wives of commanders. These acts combined abuse, humiliation, and spectacle. Cases were also mentioned in which she herself demanded sexual favors from prisoners, who shortly after disappeared, which reinforces the association between these practices and the systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses. In that closed environment, her reputation spread quickly. Among the prisoners circulated nicknames that reflected the terror she inspired: the Witch of Buchenwald and the Bitch of Buchenwald. These names showed the extent to which she was perceived as a constant threat and as an agent of arbitrary violence. The combination of her status as the commander's wife and her direct involvement in acts of violence made her a singular character within the camp. While other officers remained in offices, Ilse wielded visible power in the yards, in the barracks, and in the villa she shared with her husband. The mere presence of her figure generated immediate fear. Some survivors claimed that it was enough to meet her gaze to be singled out and to disappear in the following hours. The testimonies indicate that he frequently attended collective punishments and executions. At times, he would sit next to the SS officers to observe, and several witnesses claimed he showed enthusiasm at the scenes of violence. He was not limited to mere contemplation. He intervened in the selection of victims or aggravated the sanctions imposed by others. This decision-making ability was not formalized in the camp's organizational charts, but it was exercised in a practical and effective manner. Ilse's influence also stemmed from her relationships with doctors and officers, which granted her access to information and the possibility to intervene in decisions about the life or death of inmates. Although she did not have an official position, her closeness to formal power and her personal initiative allowed her to determine punishments and executions. For the prisoners, this made her an authority figure as dangerous as any uniformed officer. The memory of Ilse Koch in Buchenwald remained as an example of arbitrary violence and everyday abuse of power. She was not only the wife of a commander but an active participant in the repressive dynamics of the camp, marked by sadism, humiliation, and the direct exercise of power over defenseless bodies. In a system where the hierarchy was clearly defined, her unofficial influence transformed her into a central element of the terror that defined daily life in Buchenwald. The macabre museum, Skin Turned into Trophy. One of the most documented aspects of Ilse Koch's career in Buchenwald was her involvement in the selection of prisoners with tattoos for the purpose of using their skin. This episode, repeatedly recounted in survivors' testimonies and recorded in judicial processes after the war, became one of the most disturbing symbols of the crimes associated with the camp. The interest in tattoos did not arise solely from her. In 1930s Germany, some doctors and criminologists had developed theories associating tattoos with criminal behavior or social deviations. The SS, in their eagerness to give their policies a pseudoscientific veneer, promoted research in that direction within the concentration camps. In Buchenwald, doctors like Erich Wagner and Waldemar Hoven participated in studies that aimed to link tattoos with antisocial traits. These investigations were part of a broader experimentation program that included vaccine trials, analysis of infectious diseases, and methods of execution. In this context, testimonies describe that Ilse Koch took a personal interest in the observation of tattoos. Statements collected in later trials indicate that she would roam the camp on horseback or on foot, examining the prisoners and pointing out those with tattoos of striking or uncommon designs. The identified inmates would disappear in the following days. The procedure, according to numerous witnesses, included the execution of the selected prisoners and the transfer of their bodies to the camp hospital or the crematorium. There, the sections of tattooed skin were extracted, which were preserved by medical staff under SS supervision. The treatment process consisted of cleaning, tanning, and hardening the tissue with chemicals, following techniques similar to those applied to animal leather. The result was a material suitable to be worked into the production of objects. Among the items mentioned in survivors' testimonies are lampshades, bookbindings, gloves, and wallets made from tattooed skin. Several prisoners who worked in the Koch's villa claimed to have seen these pieces displayed in various rooms of the residence. These claims were revived in the post-war trials, where the prosecution presented the findings as evidence of the singularly macabre nature of Buchenwald. After the liberation of the camp in April of 1945, American troops found remnants of tattooed human skin and other objects made with human tissues. These materials were photographed, catalogued, and exhibited in public presentations organized by the occupying forces with the aim of confronting German society with the magnitude of the crimes committed in the camps. The direct relationship between those objects and Ilse Koch, however, was the subject of judicial controversy. Some witnesses claimed to have seen her personally choose pieces of tattooed skin and examine the designs. Others pointed out that she kept some of those objects in her villa where she showed them to select visitors. Nevertheless, the defense argued that there were no documents signed by her ordering the making of those items, nor conclusive evidence of her personal ownership of the pieces found. In the subsequent processes, several prisoners who had worked in the hospital or in the crematorium recounted how they received instructions to preserve tattooed skins, especially those with religious, erotic, or vivid color motifs. The practice was linked both to the medical interest in collecting material for supposed studies and to the demand for decorative items. In those statements, Ilse's initial involvement in the selection of the prisoners was highlighted, although the later phases were left in the hands of doctors and assistants. The human material was treated with the same procedures used for tanning leather, cleaning, application of chemicals, and stretching until achieving the desired flexibility. In this way, objects were made whose purpose went beyond practical utility. Their display in the Koch's villa had a symbolic character. It represented the power to reduce prisoners to mere raw materials, turned into everyday decorative objects. During the weeks following the liberation, items found at Buchenwald were shown in exhibitions organized by the United States military authorities. Fragments of tattooed skin, human organs preserved in jars, and shrunken heads, the latter prepared using exotic techniques learned outside Europe, were exhibited. These exhibitions were part of the denazification process, aimed at revealing to the German population the magnitude of Nazi crimes. Despite the strength of the material evidence, the direct attribution of specific objects to Ilse Koch continued to be debated. In 1948, General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, stated that the authenticity of the famous human skin lampshade attributed to Ilse could not be confirmed, and that the only specimen scientifically examined turned out to be made from goat skin. These doubts served the defense to question the reliability of the accusation on this specific point and caused the partial review of her initial sentence in the Dachau trial. The confusion was fueled by a mixture of verifiable eyewitness testimonies, circulating rumors among the prisoners, and war propaganda. While many survivors agreed in pointing out that Ilse participated in the selection of tattooed prisoners, not everyone claimed to have seen the finished objects in her direct possession. This lack of absolute certainty allowed the defense to allege a lack of conclusive evidence, although the general documentation on the collection of tattooed skins in Buchenwald is today considered indisputable. Subsequent historical research has confirmed that the extraction and preservation of tattooed skin were systematically practiced in Buchenwald, with active participation of SS doctors. Ilse's role, although debated in terms of concrete material evidence, repeatedly appears in testimonies as part of the initial selection process. The link between her observations in the camp and the subsequent transformation of human bodies into decorative objects reflects the degree of dehumanization reached in the concentration camp system. Fall from within, the corruption of Karl Koch. The fall of Karl Otto Koch was not due to the atrocities committed against the prisoners of Buchenwald, but to corruption and personal enrichment crimes within the SS system itself. From the beginning, the camp generated enormous amounts of confiscated goods, cash, jewelry, quality clothing, valuables, and prisoners' belongings, which by regulation were to be sent to the SS Central Economic and Administrative Office. In practice, small diversions could go unnoticed, but systematic appropriation was considered a serious transgression against the finances of the Reich. Karl Otto developed a scheme to channel the confiscated resources to his advantage. Some of the money and dental gold extracted in the crematorium ended up in private accounts. Other goods were sold through intermediaries in local markets or stored in hidden warehouses. The magnitude of these operations financed a lifestyle incompatible with the austerity code that at least formally prevailed among the SS officers. One of the most striking projects funded with these funds was the construction of an indoor riding arena and an equestrian track within Buchenwald. This facility, intended mainly for the personal entertainment of Ilse Koch, cost the equivalent of several hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks. The disproportionate investment attracted the attention of superiors and became a symbol of the family's luxury in contrast to the prisoners' misery. Added to this was the acquisition of high-end cars, including convertible models, and the opening of accounts in Switzerland to secure the diverted funds. The first suspicions arose when the financial records of Buchenwald did not match the estimates of seized goods according to the number of prisoners admitted. The SS auditors detected considerable discrepancies in the transfers reported to the central offices, which prompted the review of the camp under administrative criteria. The fate of Karl Otto was precipitated by a personal matter. The commander had contracted syphilis, a disease that posed a double risk, as a medical problem and as a scandal that could ruin his position in the SS elite. To prevent it from becoming known, he decided not to go to the military hospital and turned to the prisoners' hospital at Buchenwald itself. There he was secretly treated by Walter Kramer, an imprisoned German doctor, and his assistant, Karl Pikes. The treatment was successful, but Koch feared that the prisoners might disclose what had happened. To eliminate any risk, he ordered both to be executed, disguising them as political prisoners executed for subversive activities. The cover-up failed due to an unforeseen circumstance. Josias of Waldeck-Pyrmont, Koch's superior in Thuringia, had received medical attention from Kramer years earlier and knew his reputation as a competent professional. Upon reviewing the lists of deaths in 1941, he recognized his name and found it inconsistent to present him as a political conspirator. The suspicion led him to order a discreet investigation into Koch's management. The investigations uncovered a series of arbitrary executions aimed at eliminating inconvenient witnesses. The case of a prisoner forced to leave the camp under the pretext of fetching water, who was shot in the back under the official excuse of an attempted escape, was documented. Dr. Waldemar Hoven, the chief physician of the camp, also appeared implicated, accused of administering lethal phenol injections to silence prisoners and potential witnesses. Among the murders attributed to this network was even an SS officer with the last name Köhler, executed for knowing compromising details. The research also revealed the personal relationship between Hoven and Ilse Koch, which reinforced the perception of a closed circle of complicities around the family. Although the main responsibility fell on Karl Otto, Ilse appeared as a direct beneficiary of the embezzled wealth, particularly the equestrian arena and the maintenance of the family villa. The report prepared for Waldeck-Pyrmont estimated that the amount diverted by the Kochs exceeded 700,000 Reichsmarks, a considerable amount even by the standards of the concentration camp network. The use of forced labor in the construction of private facilities, such as the villa and the riding track, was included as an aggravating factor. Given the magnitude of the evidence, formal charges were brought against Karl Otto Koch for embezzlement of property, illegal use of camp resources, and unauthorized killing of prisoners and SS personnel. In 1943, he was arrested by the organization itself and subjected to an internal tribunal. The case was unusual. Crimes against prisoners did not constitute grounds for sanction, but corruption and public disrepute were intolerable for Himmler's leadership. The file detailed both the appropriation of property and the covering up murders of prisoners and an SS officer. For more than 1 year, Karl Otto remained imprisoned while the process developed. Ilse was investigated in parallel, mainly as a beneficiary of illicit enrichment. The absence of direct documentary evidence about her participation in the financial operations led to her formal acquittal in this first instance, although her reputation within the SS was seriously damaged. Finally, the SS court passed a death sentence on Karl Otto Koch. On the 5th of April 1945, he was shot in Buchenwald itself, just weeks before the fall of the Third Reich. His execution marked the conclusion of a path in which internal corruption proved more decisive than the mass crimes against the prisoners under his command. The relentless trial, The Woman in the Dock. The capture of Ilse Koch took place at the end of June of 1945, a few weeks after the definitive collapse of the Third Reich. After the liberation of Buchenwald in April, she had sought refuge in Ludwigsburg, where her relatives resided. For a time, she managed to go unnoticed among the millions of displaced persons trying to survive the chaos at the end of the war. Her anonymity ended when former Buchenwald prisoners recognized her on the street and reported her whereabouts to the American occupation forces. Shortly after, she was arrested and transferred to a detention center for suspected war criminals. The legal framework for prosecuting those responsible for the camps in the American occupation zone was constituted by the military trials held in Dachau. There, SS personnel who had worked in the concentration camps were judged: guards, doctors, administrators, and collaborators of different levels. The choice of the former Dachau camp as the venue for the trials had an evident symbolic value. Justice was administered in the same type of place where the crimes had taken place. The Buchenwald trial began on the 11th of April 1947, exactly 2 years after the liberation of the camp. 31 defendants took the stand, including SS officers, doctors, administrative staff, and guards of various ranks. Among all of them, the only woman was Ilse Koch. Her mere presence generated extraordinary media interest. The German and international press highlighted that it was a female defendant in a trial where men almost always appeared. Journalists revived the nicknames that circulated from the camp, the Witch of Buchenwald and the Bitch of Buchenwald. These epithets became recurring headlines, reinforcing the image of Ilse as the female embodiment of Nazi sadism. The accusations presented against her focused on 4 main axes: instigation to the murder of prisoners, systematic mistreatment, participation in sexual abuse, and selection of tattooed inmates for the creation of objects with their skin. The prosecution argued that, although she did not hold a formal position within the command hierarchy, she exerted a decisive influence over decisions that affected the life and death of numerous prisoners. The prosecutors argued that Ilse had intervened in acts of physical violence, had given orders for punishment, and had shown special interest in the tattoos of the inmates. Several witnesses claimed to have seen her point out tattooed prisoners who shortly afterward disappeared. Others recounted that in the Koch's villa, lamps and bindings made from human skin were displayed. These accounts were reinforced by the objects found in Buchenwald after the liberation: fragments of tattooed skin, preserved organs, and reduced heads. During the trial, these pieces of evidence were exhibited in the courtroom, generating a strong impact on judges, prosecutors, and observers. The international press widely disseminated the images of these objects. Photographs of lampshades and jars with human remains appeared in newspapers and news broadcasts, consolidating the public perception of Ilse as a symbol of the horrors of Buchenwald. The media coverage insisted on her being a woman, which added an element of exceptionality and increased interest in the process. The defense tried to counter the accusatory narrative by presenting Ilse as a wife and mother with no official functions. They argued that her presence in Buchenwald was solely due to her husband's professional destiny, and that she had never had administrative or command responsibility. The lawyers insisted that the stories about skin lamps and other objects were unfounded rumors, fueled by propaganda and the imagination of traumatized prisoners. Ilse personally testified, denying having participated in the management of the camp and claiming to be unaware of the abuses committed there. She also denied having possessed objects made with human skin. In an attempt to reinforce her maternal image, she appeared pregnant with her 4th child during the course of the trial. Her pregnancy generated debate in the press about the advisability of applying the death penalty to a woman in that physical condition. The prosecution insisted that their condition should not alter the severity of the accusations. The defense, on the other hand, used this fact to request clemency. The verdict was issued on the 14th of August of 1947. Of the 31 accused, 22 were sentenced to death. Ilse Koch received a life sentence, avoiding capital punishment thanks to her pregnancy. The court found her guilty of violating the laws and customs of war, proving her direct participation in acts of violence and instigation to murder prisoners. In October of that same year, she gave birth to a son conceived during her period of pretrial confinement. The press closely followed this event, highlighting the contrast between the image of a mother and that of a war criminal. The trial had an enormous media impact in the United States and Europe. Ilse's figure was definitively associated with the crimes of Buchenwald, and the iconography of the tattooed skin lampshade circulated constantly on covers, reinforcing her image as one of the most notorious defendants in the post-war trials. Life sentence, the sealed fate. The reduction of Ilse Koch's sentence in 1948 caused an international scandal. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, announced that the life imprisonment sentence issued in Dachau would be commuted to a sentence of 4 years of imprisonment. His decision was based on the lack of conclusive evidence about the objects allegedly made from human skin. Clay stated that the available forensic analyses did not irrefutably prove the authenticity of some pieces, and that in at least one case, the material turned out to be of animal origin. The announcement was met with indignation by survivor associations, political representatives, and the international press. In the United States, letters reached Congress demanding a review of the measure, while newspapers from different countries denounced an unjustified leniency towards one of the most recognized figures of the concentration system. Jewish organizations and victim groups organized public protests. In West Germany, broad sectors of opinion perceived the commutation as a sign of weakness in the punishment of Nazi crimes and as a questioning of the credibility of the post-war trials. Under the accumulated pressure, the United States authorities transferred the case to the German justice system. In 1949, Ilse Koch was released after serving the reduced sentence, but immediately taken into custody to be tried by courts of the Federal Republic of Germany in a process that would become one of the first major judicial trials of the new German state. The trial opened in Augsburg on the 27th of November of 1950. Unlike Dachau, it was a civil process carried out by German courts under the jurisdiction of the newly established Federal Republic. The goal was to demonstrate that Germany could take responsibility for judging its own criminals. The accusation against Ilse was extensive. She was charged with instigation to murder in 135 cases, as well as attempted murder and incitement to acts of violence that had resulted in deaths. The prosecution relied on testimonies collected in previous proceedings and new statements from survivors, who were summoned en masse. More than 250 witnesses were called, of whom about 50 were for the defense. The process lasted for 7 weeks of hearings. The testimonies detailed episodes of selecting tattooed prisoners, beatings against pregnant women, and collective punishments. Several statements insisted that Ilse roamed the camp, identified prisoners for execution, and exerted direct influence on guards and doctors. The consistency of the accounts, coming from independent sources, was considered by the prosecution as sufficient evidence to demonstrate a pattern of conduct. The defense argued that the testimonies were conditioned by Allied propaganda and by the trauma of the survivors. It argued that Ilse had been a wife without an official position and that her role in Buchenwald was limited to domestic accompaniment. It was insisted that there were no documents signed by her ordering executions, nor material evidence confirming her possession of objects made with human skin. During the sessions, Ilse showed signs of physical and psychological deterioration. On several occasions, she collapsed in the room and had to be removed by medical staff. The German press recorded these episodes with attention. Some interpreted them as genuine collapses under the pressure of the trial. Others considered them calculated attempts to elicit sympathy. The judges refused to suspend the process, arguing that the medical conditions did not prevent her participation in the defense. The prosecutors maintained the central accusation that Ilse, through her position as the wife of the commander of Buchenwald, had exerted enough influence to determine the fate of prisoners. They argued that her decisions and indications had immediate consequences and that this informal influence was equivalent in practice to command power. On the 15th of January of 1951, the verdict was issued. In a resolution of more than 100 pages, the court declared Ilse Koch guilty of incitement to murder, attempted murder, and incitement to acts of violence resulting in death. The judges emphasized that although she did not hold an official military position, her behavior had direct effects on the death of prisoners and the consolidation of the regime of terror in Buchenwald. The sentence was life imprisonment and the total loss of her civil rights. Ilse Koch thus became the only woman sentenced to life for crimes related to Nazi concentration camps in German courts. The decision closed the possibility of regaining freedom. In the following years, the defense filed several appeals and requests for review, alleging weakness in the evidence and excessive strictness in the interpretation of the testimonies. All were rejected by the higher courts of the Federal Republic, which confirmed the validity of the conviction and the solidity of the evidence presented in Augsburg. the judicial resolution consolidated the perception that, despite the controversies over specific objects and the authenticity of some material evidence, Ilse Koch's criminal responsibility had been established beyond reasonable doubt. Final silence, death as the only way out. After the sentence handed down in Augsburg in 1951, Ilse Koch was transferred to the Bavarian prison of Etched to serve her life sentence. There she spent the last 16 years of her life. The most famous inmate of the German prison system lived in an environment of isolation, constant surveillance, and progressive mental deterioration. The first prison reports described Ilse as a haughty and defiant prisoner. She denied any responsibility for the crimes of Buchenwald and claimed to be the victim of an international conspiracy that had turned her into a scapegoat. As the years passed, this initial attitude led to episodes of paranoia and social withdrawal. Medical evaluations from the 1950s recorded delusions, auditory hallucinations, and a persistent fear of being attacked by former camp prisoners. According to internal records, she claimed that the dead from Buchenwald visited her at night, passed through the walls of her cell, and demanded that she return the skin that had been removed from them. These statements were recorded in official reports as episodes of recurrent mental disturbance. Isolation aggravated these symptoms. Although she received sporadic visits from children and distant relatives, her social contact was limited. Other inmates avoided interacting with her, both because of her public notoriety and the hostility she aroused among the prison population. Her cellmates were rotated regularly, and several later reported that she spent hours talking to herself or writing obsessive letters, in which she mixed pleas for clemency with vague accusations of conspiracy. In the 1960s, her medical reports mentioned bouts of agitation followed by periods of lethargy. She frequently refused medication, convinced that an attempt was being made to poison her. Her distrust towards the prison staff increased, leading her to isolate herself even more from the prison environment. An event especially marked her deterioration: the suicide of her son Artwin in 1967. The firstborn, born from her marriage to Karl Otto Koch, had grown up under the weight of the surname and the stigma of being the child of the former commanders of Buchenwald. The news of his death was communicated to Ilse in prison and, according to medical records, plunged her into a state of despair that intensified her delusions. Since then, she insisted that the camp survivors sought revenge and that infiltrators in the prison harassed her to kill her. The correspondence of her last few months, preserved in Bavarian judicial archives, reflects a clear deterioration in her ability to express herself. In letters addressed to her son Uwe, conceived during her imprisonment in 1947, she insistently requested his intervention to achieve her release and spoke of a personal catastrophe that would completely destroy her. She reiterated that the ghosts of Buchenwald haunted her at night and that she heard their voices in the walls of her cell. In other letters, she expressed the conviction that former prisoners had infiltrated the penitentiary staff and were preparing her murder. She requested additional protection and asked to be transferred to another, more secure prison. The medical staff tried to intervene with the resources available at the time, but the symptoms persisted and worsened. In the last few weeks of her life, the guards observed a change in her behavior. She became more silent, less prone to complain, and apparently resigned. Some interpreted this behavior as a sign of stability, while others viewed it as a warning. On the 1st of September 1967, Ilse Koch was found dead in her cell during the morning inspection. She had hanged herself with a sheet tied to the window bars. The official report indicated that the death had occurred during the early hours of the morning. The news was quickly spread by the German and international press. For the prison authorities, the outcome was not unexpected after years of mental deterioration and following his son's suicide. In a handwritten note found in his cell, he wrote, "There is no other solution for me. Death is my only liberation." These words constitute his last written testimony and reflect the despair of a life marked by isolation, mental illness, and the weight of an inescapable past. The burial was carried out without ceremony or public acknowledgement in the prison cemetery at Etched. The grave received no distinctive mark. The absence of family members and any form of mourning symbolized the end of a trajectory that had begun in the heart of the Nazi regime and ended in the absolute isolation of a cell.